years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So last week, we focused on our attention on participation in democratic systems of government. And we learned about why certain political scientists predicted that people would not participate politically, why it's not rational to vote, for example. And then we reviewed the work of Schlossman, Verba, and Brady, who showed that, in fact, people do participate and explained why. And so the focus there was on forms of political participation that operate within the system. So that's to say, in democracies, we have institutions and mechanisms in place that encourage and channel and routinize certain types of participation, including voting, communicating with your elected representative, maybe volunteering in a political campaign, even running for office or holding office. And a democracy depends on this type of participation. And people generally believe that the more of it there is, the healthier the democracy is. This week, however, we focus attention on political participation that takes place outside of the system. And here I'm talking about political action that takes the form of protests, rallies, marches, blockades, sit-ins, hunger strikes, boycotts, and even violent political action like self-immolation and looting and rioting, or armed blockades, or the destruction of buildings and offices and machinery. And we're talking here about, just to give you some examples, we're talking here about things like the No Kings protests against Donald Trump that took place all across the United States in 2025. And we're talking about the September 2025 protests in France, when more than 250,000 people took to the streets to protest against proposed budget cuts. And then there's this protest against the far right in Germany, also in 2025. In Canada, we're talking about things like the Freedom Convoy, which was the 2022 protest against mask and vaccine mandates for truckers. And that took place primarily in downtown Ottawa, but also involved several US-Canada border crossings. And there were also smaller marches and blockades in Toronto and in other cities across Canada. We're talking about the massive global protests against the war in Gaza. We're also talking about the movement for Black Lives, which is a social movement that uses strategies like protests and rallies and marches to call out police brutality, in particular police brutality, but also institutionalized anti-Black racism in general, mostly in the United States, but also here in Canada and across the world. And we're also talking about Indigenous protests against the construction of gas and oil pipelines that cross Indigenous ancestral territory. We're talking about the Idle No More movement, protesting Canadian legislation that dismantled environmental protection laws and endangered Indigenous and other land in Canada. We're talking about the G20 protests against capitalism and poverty in Toronto, and the land back protests demanding the return of Indigenous land and sovereignty. And there's something that's very valuable and powerful about this type of political action. So first of all, Voting and elections are very sporadic political activities. They take place on an institutional schedule according to a time frame that is not responsive to actual things that are happening in the world. So you vote every 4 years or every 6 years, and in the years between elections, the people have little say over what their elected representatives are doing, unless they take to the streets. As this quote says, civil society organizations and mobilizations exert continual pressure on elected officials to expose government wrongdoing, change policy, or put new issues on the agenda. So, civil society organizations and social movements are a vehicle through which people can put issues on the agenda and, as this quote says, expose government wrongdoing, but also express their interests and concerns in the period between elections, in the period where we don't have institutionalized mechanisms of participation. So, political sciences, social movement literature studies those types of movements. And one question they ask is, when and under what circumstances are people motivated to protest? So this is a similar question to the one that Schlossman, Verba, and Brady were asking last week, right? Their question was, why do people participate in politics? But they were interested in why they participate in institutionalized political participation, more like voting. Why do people vote? And here we're talking about the question, why do people get motivated to go out into the streets and participate politically? Many protests are, and so one common reason that people do go out to participate in political action of this sort is because they feel a sense of injustice. So protests are often framed as opposition to a rights violation. Somebody has violated our rights, and that's why we're out in the streets protesting. So in Minneapolis, for example, people are marching in protest against the presence of ICE in their city and against the murder of Renee Good, and more generally against government policies that allow ICE agents to detain and to deport people without any kind of oversight. So if we think about all of the mobilization in the United States, it's going on as a result of a sense of injustice. And then sometimes that sense of injustice is driven by what protesters perceive as broken promises. So when Indigenous people in Canada occupy land and build blockades to stop mining and to prevent pipelines from being built, or to prevent a town from developing a golf course on unceded land, which is what happened in the case of the Kanesatake protests way back in 1990. The people who come out and protest are driven by the belief that the land in question belongs to them, and that the government of Canada signed treaties that gave them sovereignty over that land, and that it is violating those treaties. So let's just go back here to this slide, where you can see this sign that says, "Remember, Canada, you are a treaty partner." So that's the language that they're using to express the legitimacy of their political action, is calling Canada to recognize its own responsibilities. The people who protested with the Freedom Convoy were also driven by a sense of injustice. In this case, they believed that the Canadian government was violating their freedoms by imposing mask and vaccine mandates. So, in other words, there are a wide range of reasons that people are motivated to participate in political expressions and actions that are not institutionalized through the system of government. So, a lot of reasons that people go out and become engaged in social movements and protests and marches and so on and so forth. And whatever those reasons are, they're often expressed through the language of injustice. So other social theorist movements are not that interested in the reasons that people get involved in a protest or a blockade. There are literally thousands of specific political reasons that people protest. And so other people are more interested in when those protests succeed and when they fail. So let's start by thinking about or looking at what they mean by succeed. What does it look like for a social movement to succeed? What might success look like? And one of the things that it might look like is gathering a lot of support for a cause. So if people organize a protest, one of the first things that a news organization would report, or that the organization that organized the protest itself would report, is how many people came out in support of their protest or in support of their march. So in 2017, for example, we had the Women's March on Washington, and that was considered to be very successful because in the one location in Washington, D.C., 470,000 people turned up for that march in Washington, D.C. There were over 5 million people who marched across the United States. So they were marching in Washington, D.C., but there were other marches across the U.S., and there were even marches outside of the United States. So there were over 7 million people who were involved in the Women's March in January of 2017. So in terms of sheer numbers, that was considered to be a very successful mobilization. Another thing that success looks like is if the social movement succeeds, manages to change government policy. So that might look like if the Freedom Convoy had succeeded in ending mask and vaccine mandates, for example, which is what they were opposed to. Or let's say that protesters managed to get Israel to withdraw from Gaza, or if protesters in Iran managed to bring down the Iranian government that they are protesting against. All three of those would be a sign of success in the sense that the protesters succeeded in producing their policy outcome, the policy outcome that they were looking to achieve. A third common sign of success is changing public opinion. So an example of this would be that a majority of Canadians now know about the Indian residential school system, and they believe that it was wrong. So 10, 12 years ago, majority of people did not know about the residential school system. And if they did know, they thought that, it was a good faith effort on the part of the Canadian government to educate Indigenous children. And now the whole narrative around the Indian residential school systems has changed, and public opinion is different now than it was 12 years ago. as a result of the movement for Black Lives and their mobilizations in 2020, a majority of Americans and also Canadians are aware that racialized people are often subjected to police brutality. That was a change in public opinion that the Black Lives Matter movement and mobilizations generated in 2020 and 2021. Another sign of success is if a social movement, if a protest or a march or a gathering develops the organizational capacity to persist. So again, I'm going to use the example of the Movement for Black Lives, which is a coalition of 50 or so organizations that first came into being in 2013 because they were protesting against police violence against Black people, black people in general. So it came into existence in 2013, but then it persisted so that it in 2020, it was reactivated after the murder of George Floyd, and it was there, all of the sort of organizational network existed, the administrative and organizational network existed so that they could mobilize very, very quickly in order to generate another high level, very visible social movement after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. And then subsequently, those protests also died down, but the organizational capacity of those organizations that are loosely configured as the Movement for Black Lives, those organizations continue to exist, and they're now involved in organizing some of the opposition against ICE. So some of the protests that you see in the United States now against American immigration policies and deportation crackdowns and so on and so forth, some of that is being organized by these same organizations that persisted over time. So that's also a sign of success. And then similarly, like a similar idea is that a movement might become institutionalized as an organization that carries out some type of work over the longer term. So in 2025, we had 2 mass protests in the United States against Donald Trump, and they were called No Kings protests, and that was generally the sign that people carried, No Kings. So they were identified as No Kings protests. But No Kings is now subsequently an ongoing alliance of organizations that continues to do education and organizing work in protest against the Trump administration. So that's what success looks like. So the thing that I'm arguing here is that a lot of social movements literature is interested in the question of when movements succeed and when movements fail. In order to think about when movements succeed, we need to define what success looks like. So now we've defined what success looks like, and now what we're going to look at is the theories that political scientists have come up with in order to make the case, this is why they succeed and this is why they fail. So not how we measure success, which we've already done, but why movements succeed. And the first theory that people have, this is a No Kings. This is something that I got from the No Kings website, which in order to make the point that although the mobilizations are sporadic, one happened in June, one happened in October of 2025, the organizational apparatus of the group is ongoing. So this is from the No Kings website. So the first theory that we're going to take a look at that tries to explain why social movements succeed or fail is resource mobilization theory. And here the idea is that movements succeed to the extent that they have access to resources and are able to appropriately or successfully mobilize those resources. So the Freedom Convoy is an excellent example here of the resources. We're going to walk through sort of what counts as a resource that the Freedom Convoy was able to mobilize in order to basically shut down Ottawa for I don't know, 4 to 6 weeks in, what was it, February of 2022, I'm thinking. So the first resource that they had was trucks. The main strategy of this protest was to have people who drive 18-wheeler trucks, big transport trucks, to converge on downtown Ottawa and block the city. And so not everybody has access to a very large number of 18-wheeler trucks, but the people who organized the Freedom Convoy did have access to 18-wheeler trucks, and the people who supported that mobilization, a lot of them were professional truck drivers, and they were willing to put themselves and their trucks on the line in order to support this mobilization. Another thing that they had quite a bit of was money. This is unusual for most organizations, most mobilizations, but the Freedom Convoy, or sometimes called the Truckers Convoy, had a lot of money. They immediately launched a GoFundMe page, and they were getting a lot of money from supporters across Canada. And they were also getting a lot of money from supporters in the United States. So people who shared their political views, who were across the border, so right-wing political activists in the United States, were also raising money to support the people who were in Ottawa with the Truckers Convoy. So they had access to more money than most mobilizations have access to, and that is part of what allowed them to sustain this mobilization in Ottawa for such a long period of time. As I said, weeks and weeks. Another thing they had was whiteness. And this is a resource to the extent that it's something that you can use to your advantage. And whiteness was a resource because the color of their skin literally protected many of the sort of the organizers and the people who were converging on Ottawa. It protected them from being seen as threatening. A lot of people make the argument that the Ottawa police, even though they knew that these truckers were coming, and they knew what their intentions were, they didn't mobilize to protect the city against them because they didn't see them as a threat. And the reason they didn't see them as a threat was because they looked similar to what the Ottawa police looked like, right? So they felt that they had a commonality with these people and that they weren't threatening. The organizers and also regular participants in the truckers' convoy also had direct access to YouTube and other forms of social media, so they were able to get their message across directly. Nowadays, this would be a resource that any mobilization, any social movement would have, but it distinguishes contemporary social movements from those that existed 15 or 20 years ago, where that people who were part of a mobilization or part of a social movement didn't necessarily have their own communication platform. They might have to rely on whatever the news was saying about them, and they might have to rely on the news to get out their message. In that vein, another thing that the Freedom Convoy had as a resource was sympathetic media. So not only did they have their own direct access to social media, but they also had media that was sympathetic to their cause, like Rebel Media and also Fox News. So these were two media sources that were willing to create, to keep this mobilization in the news, and also to report positively about what they were doing and what their message was, what their tactics were, and so on and so forth. They also had something quite unusual for a social movement, which is former soldiers and police who were running logistics and planning for the organization. So one of the things that people said at the time was that this was an action, a political action that was very well run logistically. And they made the case that that's because they had people running it who ran logistics for the military and for the police. And so this is what they did professionally. And so they were good at their jobs. They also had allies within the Ottawa police who were leaking information to members and leaders of the convoy. So they would tell them where they were going to be, where they were going to be arresting people, what they would turn a blind eye to, what they couldn't turn a blind eye to, and so on and so forth. They also had a very large number of police who were sympathetic to their cause and therefore refused to enforce bylaws. So, for example, one of the very disruptive things that the Freedom Convoy, that the truckers did, was they would honk their horns loudly and continuously all night long. All day long too, but more effectively all night long. And so they were keeping people awake. People who lived in downtown Toronto weren't able to sleep. There were just these horns going all night long. And Ottawa has, did I say Toronto? Ottawa. Everybody lived in Ottawa. This was mainly in Ottawa. Ottawa has noise bylaws. It also has bylaws against, parking in the street illegally. It has all of these laws that could have been used to tow trucks away or to fine people for honking their horns and for making noise after a certain time of night and for parking illegally and for obstructing traffic and blocking a public street and so on and so forth. And they didn't use any of those sort of standard mechanisms that they could have used in order to get rid of the convoy. Another resource that the Freedom Convoy had was Canadian symbols. Things like the flag they used a lot, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which they claimed was being violated, the national anthem, which they sung all the time. So they really used these Canadian symbols as a sort of claiming the nation. Like one of their arguments was essentially that 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 they were Canadian and that they sort of exemplified the spirit of Canada, and that the government of Canada, with its COVID restrictions and vaccine mandates and so forth, that it was anti-Canadian, that it was violating the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that it was overstepping its power, and that it was essentially being anti-Canadian. And so they sort of literally cloaked themselves in the Canadian flag and co-opted the national anthem as their song and not the song of anybody else who would oppose them, including the government. And then this isn't on the list here on your slide, but one of the really important resources that they had was a very widespread sense of grievance that arose from COVID and from the government's response to COVID. So even people who supported, the vaccine mandate and the mask mandates and things like that, almost everybody around the world, or almost every government around the world, sort of received backlash for how they responded to the COVID pandemic. And no matter what they did, basically, most governments that were in power during the pandemic were voted out of office when they came up for re-election, because people were generally critical of whatever it is that they'd done in order to respond to the pandemic. And since that's sort of a universal thing, something that happened across the world, people argue that they weren't really responding to the government's way of handling the pandemic. They were responding to the circumstances of the pandemic itself, and basically their own sense of fear, loss, all of the things that came up in the context of the pandemic. And they were sort of wanting to set that aside or put that behind them. And so one of the things they did was sort of turn against the government in office. So this kind of widespread, generalized feeling of grievance was that was a result of the COVID pandemic, grievance against government, was one of the resources that the organizers of the Freedom Convoy had to work with in 2022. And the reason that I say that COVID was a resource is that Tara Litch and others who were generally considered to be the organizers of the Freedom Convoy had tried to do the exact same thing 2 years before. So they had tried to organize a truckers' convoy to go to Ottawa and protest against, I can't remember what, something that, something related to the government of Justin Trudeau. And it didn't work. They did not manage to get people out into the streets. Truckers did not drive en masse to Ottawa in order to protest. People basically thought, I would rather, use my truck to make money and transport goods for the next 6 weeks than spend it sitting in downtown Ottawa. But in 2022, those same people made a different calculus, and they did go and mobilize against the vaccine and mask mandates. So in that sense, COVID and opposition, a widespread sense of grievance surrounding COVID and the way the government responded to COVID was a resource that they could call on. And so that's how resource mobilization theory would explain the success of the Freedom Convoy in 2022. All right. So if you were to get a question like, how does resource mobilization theories explain the success of the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, that would be your answer, because the Freedom Convoy had all of these resources that it was able to mobilize. Another theory that political scientists use is the political opportunity model. That also explains why some social movements succeed and some fail. So the political opportunity model is essentially makes the argument that movements arise in response to political opportunities. And by political opportunities, they mean openings that exist when a system is vulnerable and perhaps as a result of a crisis of legitimacy. So a political opportunity is there's something going on in government that makes government particularly weak right now, or makes some branch of government weak, or maybe a political leader is unpopular. It's that sort of looking at the structure of government to see what the chinks in the armor are. What are the opportunities that we can take advantage of here? And this is a theory, the political opportunity model is a theory that arose in order to explain the success of the civil rights movement in the United States. And in that case, the political opportunity that opened up was basically a wedge or an ideological and political gap between the southern states of the United States, so the governments of states like Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana and Georgia, and the federal government in Washington, D.C. So in other words, the southern states were enforcing legislation that kept African Americans from voting. The southern states were enforcing legislation that kept African Americans from voting, and they were segregating schools and bathrooms and buses and lunch counters by race, and they were generally violating the civil and constitutional rights of Black Americans in those southern states. Those laws that were being those laws that existed in those states and were being enforced in those states were a violation of the United States Constitution. So all of those organizations, all of those states had been violating the U.S. Constitution, which calls for and rests on the idea of equal rights. But the federal government in Washington, D.C. had been turning a blind eye to this for almost 100 years, 70 years, let's say. 70 or 80 years. So they've been ignoring this for 70 or 80 years. And in the 1960s, civil rights leaders had, for the first time, they had a president in the White House who was willing to use his political capital and his national resources to enforce the rights of Southern Black Americans. So the political opportunity, the political opening, was an ideological gap between the federal government in Washington, D.C. and the state governments of these southern states. And so that's the political opportunity, or one of the political opportunities. Another one is that many of the most important victories of the civil rights movement were won through the courts. And so that was another political opportunity, the opportunity to use the legal system to uphold and enforce rights that were constitutionally entrenched, that were in the Constitution, and yet had been violated for almost the entire history of the United States. So using the courts to fight racist legislation that was enacted by state governments, that was another opening. It was another wedge in the system. So basically, the legal system was fighting the political system in these states and sort of struck down all of the laws that they had been using in order to discriminate against African Americans and prevent them from voting and to segregate them. And thinking about the civil rights movement and the role of political opportunity made me think about the extent to which the first Trump presidency, so, from 2016 to 2020, the extent to which that first Trump presidency created a political opportunity for the movement for Black lives. So if a political opening or weakening is an important condition for the emergence of a social movement, then it may have been the case that the very, very blatant racism and sexism and ethno-national xenophobia of the Trump administration and of the right wing in the United States that it enabled and gave a platform to, those things might have created a political opportunity. So what I'm trying to say here is that for many Americans, the government in that first Trump administration, the government lacked all legitimacy. A large proportion of Americans believed that the government lacked legitimacy during that administration. And so a movement that called out the abuse of power that was perpetrated by the institutions of the state, may have gained more traction, in part because people generally had, at that point in time, and then again later in the second Trump administration, widespread distrust of state institutions. So that level of distrust in the government, distrust in the president, and in his policies and the institutions he was upholding, all of that created a much broader base of support in favor of protecting the lives of people against police brutality. Many more people than usual were willing to believe that police engaged in brutality against ordinary citizens. Under the Trump administration, they started to believe that there was such a thing as police brutality, whereas under a previous administration that had enjoyed a great deal of legitimacy, say, for example, the immediately prior Obama administration, people would not necessarily have believed that the police were guilty of police brutality because they would have believed in the institutions of government. Another theory about the relative success of social movements is a theory that focuses attention on what political scientists call framing processes. And framing refers to the way that activists talk about their grievances and demands, the language and the words they use to establish that they are political actors and that they have a right to make a claim. So the question here is, how do they frame their cause? How do people make themselves legitimate political actors? So again, I'm going to use some examples. Indigenous people in Canada establish their political legitimacy by invoking their connection to the land and their continual presence on the land going back thousands of years. So basically, this is our land and we've been here much longer than you have. That establishes their right to occupy space. And they invoke treaties that were signed by agents of the British colonial government, and then were later broken by the colonial government and by the Canadian government as well. They refer to their sovereignty. They use the language of sovereignty, and that confers on them a right to self-government and a right to self-determination. And very often, especially in the last decade or so, they link their demands to stewardship of the earth. So that links Indigenous rights and Indigenous people to environmental rights and environmental protection. And that also establishes their legitimacy, their political legitimacy. And it also establishes sort of what political space they're occupying and who their political alliances are with and who their politics are against. So in other words, movements and leaders frame who they are and what their grievances are in a particular way that will give them political traction. And whether they do a better or worse job of framing their grievances and who they are and why they have a right to be there and who they have a right to speak for and so on and so forth, all of that framing work can be more or less successful, and that will contribute to the relative success of a social movement. And when I say framing processes, I'm not saying that what a particular motion, that the way that a social movement speaks and identifies its concerns isn't true. And I'm not saying that it's just a PR strategy. Normally, it is true. But what I'm saying is that it's just one thing that's true among a whole host of true things. And some of those true things would work to give people a political voice, and some of them would not. So let's go back to the Freedom Convoy, which is a good example. The Freedom Convoy framed their demands differently from, for example, Indigenous rights activists in Canada. So just as the name highlighted, the name Freedom Convoy, they framed their demands as a matter of freedom and rights. They wanted freedom from government overreach. They insisted that mask and vaccine mandates violated their rights to bodily autonomy. They also insisted that they had a right to be in Ottawa or wherever they wanted to be, really, because they were Canadian and Canada is a free country. So they have a right to block roads in downtown Ottawa and to park in the street because this was their country and they had that freedom. And then along with rights and freedom, they invoked a particular version of democracy and sovereignty. So at one point, they wrote and delivered a document that they called a Memorandum of Understanding. And in the Memorandum of Understanding, they demanded the removal of the Canadian government, and they insisted that they would take government into their own hands as the sovereign representatives of the people. Um, Protesters in Minneapolis frame their demands using language that establishes their commitment to the rule of law. So they are not, for the most part, making arguments about immigrants. And that might be because immigration is controversial. A lot of Americans are ambivalent or even opposed to immigrants. Um, but due process is a fundamental pillar of the US justice system. And so demanding due process is a powerful framing device. It's a frame that legitimizes their politics and their demands and establishes the validity of their protest. Due process, that's it. That's everything. All we're asking for here is due process. Um, and then here's another one, another sign, another way of framing the politics of what's going on here, which says just ICE murders Americans. And this is a statement, you might argue that this is a statement that's saying essentially, this isn't just about immigrants. ICE isn't only murdering immigrants, ICE murders Americans. And so that's framing it as a national issue, right? Something everybody should be concerned about in the United States because we're all Americans here. And so this is a threat to all of us, not just to other people. And then here's another framing device also used in the ICE protests that invokes the fundamental ideals of democracy. The power of the people is stronger than the people in power. So that's a call to democratic ideals and values. So one of the things that's really interesting about protests around the world is that the commitments of liberalism and democracy furnish the language for many movements all across the world. If those movements are in democratic countries, then they make the claim that the government is violating the principles it is supposed to be living up to. They argue that democracy or that the system of democracy has been corrupted by the officials and representatives who were elected to uphold it. That's one of the arguments that protesters make against the Trump administration, for example. And it's precisely because democracy lodges sovereignty in the people that it gives people the vocabulary to justify or to establish the legitimacy of their actions, almost regardless of what those actions amount to. And that's part of the reason that the language of liberalism and democracy is powerful in all social movements because it basically establishes the political legitimacy of what the people want and the people's voice. If this is our voice, then it is by definition valid because we live in a democracy or we're demanding to live in a democracy. So this all brings us to the reading that you did for today, which is a chapter from a book about the movement for Black Lives that was written by Diva Woodley, who is a professor of political science at Brown University. And in the chapter that you read for today, Woodley argues that social movements are central or crucial or integral to the health and operation of democracy. So, as we know, Democrats and Democratic theorists are pretty united in their belief that democracy depends on institutionalized participation. And the more institutionalized participation there is, the more people vote, the better or stronger democracy is. And many of those same people might also argue that participation outside the system is not good for democracy. They might argue that protests and marches and blockades threaten stability, they make countries unstable, and if those countries are democracies, then they can make democracies unstable. Most protests are against, most of the protests in the world are against government policies and government leaders. And if the people in the streets succeed in changing policies or in ousting leaders who were democratically elected, if they get rid of leaders who were democratically elected, then they can be, hypothetically at least, accused of undermining and possibly even destroying the institutions of democracy. So that's the standard argument that some people have made, that the place to participate, the appropriate place to participate in democratic politics is at the ballot box. You have a right to exercise your vote, but going out into the streets and protesting is destabilizing and dangerous. And this is certainly the position that governments often take, as police often clash with protesters. But Diva Woodley argues, on the other hand, that social movements are intrinsic to the proper functioning of democracy. She argues that they are not harmful to democracy or even and that they're not even external to democracy, but instead they're an important component of its proper functioning. So here's what she says on page 3 of her book, Reckoning. She says, movements are necessary, not only to address the concerns of those engaging in public interest, nor only for the ethical purpose of achieving more just conditions for all, but also for the health and survival of democracy as such. Movements are what keep democracy from falling irrevocably into the pitfalls of oligarchy and the bureaucratic iron cage described by Max Weber, chiefly dehumanization, expropriation, and stagnation. What she's arguing here is that democracy is a set of rules and institutions. And like all rules and institutions, democracy can become what she calls stagnant. It can resist change. It can become unresponsive to the will of the people. So, bureaucracies can just sort of develop a life of their own, and even the institutions of Parliament or of Congress or of the Senate can become sclerotic. They become so paralyzed by their own rules and their institutional ways of doing things that they're no longer responsive to the people. An oligarchy is a form of rule in which power rests with a small group of people. And Woodley says continually throughout this chapter that the purpose of social movements is to stop democracies from becoming oligarchies, to stop them from being captured by a small and powerful political elite. So it's in order to continually revitalize democracy from below by opening space for the voice of the people to be heard and to actually change the way things are done in the system as it exists. So she goes on to say, analysts of democracy spanning diverse political times and traditions, from Thomas Jefferson to Frederick Douglass, Max Weber to John Dewey, and Rosa Luxemburg to Angela Davis, have warned that though democracy is based on the idea that the people will govern, checking governors and institutions' tendency toward consolidating power and ruling in the interests of the few is work that requires muscular and often rebellious engagement from the people. So she is sort of weighing in on the side of this muscular and rebellious engagement from the people. She would argue that the No Kings protests in the United States are exactly an example of this muscular and rebellious engagement that she thinks democracy requires. But she also focuses attention on what people believe and on whether people believe that their governments are responsive, whether they believe that their government represents them and that the system includes mechanisms that channel and amplify their voice and their interests. And her argument here is that social movements improve people's faith in democracy. When people pour out into the streets to protest some government policy that they believe is wrong, one of the things they're doing is expressing fundamental hope and faith in the system of government. They are expressing their belief that their voice matters, that they believe in the power of the people as the foundation of democracy. And they're sort of forcing the proposition that they can limit the power of the people that they have elected. So it's a profoundly hopeful and sort of insistent kind of political statement going out into the streets that you would only do if you actually believed in democracy. So going out into the streets reinforces, sort of counterintuitively reinforces people's beliefs in democracy because it reinforces their belief that they can make a difference with nothing but their bodies and their voices. And I want to conclude by leaving you with another thought that sort of links back to the lecture from last week. People who are interested in democracy often complain all the time about low voter turnout. And they focus their complaints on the demographic of people who vote the least, which is often young people. So we get the lowest voter turnout among people in the 18 to 35-year-old age bracket. But those participation numbers are flipped when it comes to protests. Young people are among the most likely to march and to mobilize. This has been most visible in climate action mobilization around the world. But it's also true in lots of protests, including Black Lives Matter, No Kings, the French Block Everything protests. It's true in Iran, in Argentina, during the Arab Spring, and on and on and on. And if you believe, as Woodley does, the protests are intrinsic to democratic politics, if you believe that social movements are sort of a backbone of democracy, if you believe that they're one of the things that keep democracies democratic, then young people are also playing a crucial role in supporting democracy through political participation, except that their political participation does not primarily take place at the ballot box. It takes place in the streets. And that's it. Thank you very much. I hope you have a good week.